I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me along to speak tonight. Fernando's a hard act to follow, and well, we'll see how we go. The first thing I want to say is that if we look at the period of the 21st century, particularly from about 2002 to 2012, then this was one of the best periods for the Latin American people for many, many decades, and perhaps we could argue at any time in the history of Latin America. What we saw in that period is that for almost all the countries, then people's incomes went up. We saw poverty and extreme poverty go down, and we also saw, remarkably, a decrease in inequality, so that Latin America was the only region in the world, I believe, where we see inequality decrease. As you would know, in the developed world, it's increasing. In Asia, it's increasing. In Africa, it was increasing. So Latin America is, of course, the most unequal place in the world, but this was a period of a decline in that extreme inequality. Now, it declined for a number of reasons, but one of them was that we saw in all the countries just about an increased spending on welfare, and part of this was a policy that actually came from the World Bank back in the 1990s when they realised that neoliberalism was destroying people, and that was conditional cash transfers. So this is governments giving a little bit of money targeted particularly towards women with children, and to ensure that the children went to school, that they were vaccinated, that women attended health centres when they were pregnant. And this has resulted then in some investment in human development over that period, at least to 2012. Now, as I said, this is not just in pink tide countries, or the pink tide, if you say those countries that voted centre-left following the election of Chavez in 1998 in Venezuela. In part, of course, it obeyed the Millennium Development Goals, but it was also due to the fact that this was a period where the terms of trade swung in favour of commodities. And as you know, in the case of Australia, this is the period of the mining boom, the demand in China, and we see the same sort of forces acting on the economies in Latin America. So whether they're producing minerals or agricultural products, then these were sold on the international market. So we see then a recovery from certainly the crisis of the 1980s and the debt, where you got structural adjustment, austerity as it's called these days, imposed on people. So this was a good period. And it's probably a good period too because the United States was rather involved in the Middle East, and so it took its attention off Latin America to some extent. So that was a plus. And we also saw, as Fernando was saying, this was a period where there's a lot more cooperation amongst the Latin American peoples and the Latin American governments, and this was pushed very, very strongly, of course, by Hugo Chavez. Now, Fernando mentioned the fact that, there's 50 shades of pink in Latin America, and if we look at these three countries we're interested in tonight, we can see something of these differences. In Brazil, we get a redistribution take place, and here by one of these conditional cash transfer systems, the Bolsa Familia, as it was named there, and this gave money to families to ensure the children went to school and also to ensure that they were vaccinated. So this was a big plus for those people, and it helped to lift a lot of people out of poverty, and especially extreme poverty. Employment increased, and part of the economic strategy was to put money into people's pockets so that they would spend, and this would stimulate the economy. And this worked quite well. So we saw the government set minimum wages for servants, for example, for maids. which horrified the upper class and people who define themselves as middle class in Latin America. One of the problems, though, in Brazil was that before Lula came to power, in part to obtain power, then he reassured the capitalists that he would not be attacking them while he was in power, and Dilma did the same sort of thing before she was elected. And so we don't see a radical push, therefore. We're not, in the case of Brazil, we're not looking at a socialist project as such. If anything, we could say that the Workers' Party was something like the Labor Party here. Their argument was they can manage the capitalist system better and that they can raise living standards in a way that the other parties could not do. And so we don't see the Workers' Party drawing upon some of those very important social movements in Latin America, in Brazil, particularly the movement of the people without land. So they're kept at a distance. And those people that are lifted out of poverty, and there was enormous, we're talking about millions and millions of people in the case of Brazil, we don't see the Workers' Party really making a concerted effort to get them politically involved, or not to the extent that was really necessary when the Workers' Party comes under attack in the last few years. Argentina followed a different trajectory. Argentina really, they had to recover from the enormous economic crisis of 2001, 2002. And I was in Argentina around that time, and it was just horrendous. So many people lost their jobs, people didn't have money, there was a lot of bartering going on the streets, people were collecting garbage in the streets through the night, whole families. People didn't have enough to eat. It was really a terrible situation. That was the period where a lot of people are saying, don't bring the politicians back. We don't want to have a state. The state has failed us. Neoliberalism has driven us to this situation. So what the Kirchners did was that they really re-established the state itself. And they did that by increasing employment. And so over time we see wages go up, and similar to Brazil, they pushed to have people, they pushed capitalists and so on to pay workers so that workers had money in their pocket, and this drove the economy along. And they also emphasised the importance of not just preserving the manufacturing sector, but of increasing the manufacturing sector. And they didn't have a huge amount of success with this in percentage terms, but at least they kept the manufacturing that had been there in the 1990s, which of course had already suffered because of the austerity policies of the 1980s. So that was a success. What they did do is, and particularly under Cristina Fernandez, is that they established a much more universal welfare system than had ever existed in Argentina, so that almost 95% of people now have access to the old age pension. It was nothing like that in the past. So it was the pension reform. And similarly, they brought in welfare for families, and particularly poorer families with children. So once again, it's an investment in human development. They also brought the debt under control, although one of the problems that they had in the latter period was vulture funds in the US and judgments in US courts that went against them, and this certainly drained their energy. In part, their program was successful because they imposed super taxes on the export sector, particularly the export of agricultural products. And this also resulted in a huge fight in 2008 with the farmers, with the big landowners, and very similar to the situation in Australia with the tax on mining here. Then it was one that the government didn't really win in the end. And it was a very similar struggle. to the Australian one. They did nationalise if it was necessary to do so. But once again, you are looking at a fairly traditional developmentalist policy. You're not looking at a form of socialism as such. Now, when we look at Venezuela, then it's really rather different. This was the most radical experiment that's occurred with regard to the attempt to establish socialism in a country since the collapse of the Soviet Union and possibly before that. So what Chavez was emphasising was that people should be revolutionaries, that it was up to people to build a socialist society. And they could do this through participatory democracy. This did lead to a tension between the two forms of democracy. So you've got a liberal democracy, a representative democracy, and at the same time the attempt to establish a grassroots participatory democracy form in which people at the base would be able to take control of development, of economic enterprises. So initially the emphasis was placed on the formation of cooperatives, and then subsequently they moved towards the formation of communes. Now, this is a fairly difficult thing to do. I mean, nothing like this has been attempted before. And so, as you would expect, with experiments, there's both failure and successes with this. But there are a large number of people in Venezuela, certainly, who benefited from this. So the state itself is going to provide the funding, as Fernando was saying. This is largely going to be drawn from the oil sector, and then those funds are going to be put down to local levels so that for people to invest themselves in productive enterprises. Now we've got the problem with the low price of oil, then it's difficult for this to continue. Well, as Fernando was saying, and as you know, Brazil and Argentina have already moved to the right, and we've got enormous attack on President Maduro in Venezuela itself, and as Fernando mentioned, the Chavistas, if we want to call them that, suffered a real electoral defeat at the end of last year, so they don't control the Congress. Now, why do we see this move to the right, and why is the right having this success? Well, one reason is the end of the economic boom that was based on the export of commodities. Once again, you can look at the case of Australia here. The mining boom has ended. And similarly for our Latin Americans, then the export of the commodities has declined. So there's not that same amount of money coming in from that. And of course, all through this period, then the right, as Fernando was saying, has been attacking these governments. The old political and economic elites never accepted these sorts of experiments and changes and these attempts to redistribute the wealth and the income a little bit. They just don't accept it. I mean, these are greedy bastards, let's face it. What can you do with them? I've got a few ideas. So that has been a problem, and they've continued that battle all through the period, and now they're experiencing some success. And they will use any mechanisms, whether they're military coups, economic sabotage, using constitution, or getting people out in the street and creating mayhem in the street. Well, this is right versus left. I mean, this would go anywhere, and it's what you would expect. And of course, these leaders expected this sort of thing as well. But it's something that has to be dealt with. The United States, needless to say, also supports the right, and it has those organisations that you probably know about for channeling money to opposition forces in these countries. And they've been doing it. So, whether they're using, their international development agency, or whether they're using the their foundations for spreading democracy, as they say, and using this to channel money to opposition parties, and their various departments of state and justice and defence and so on. So, all that is there. And of course, they're supported by the international media by and large. So, if in the case of Venezuela, if you take the negative stories about Venezuela that have been coming out ever since Chavez was first elected, they're quite extraordinary. And they continue to be extraordinary. So, some of you may have seen those reports about people eating dogs or, going into the zoo and attacking animals and ripping animals apart with their bare hands and eating them. And all of these stories, of course, have no basis in reality that we know of anyway. But the international press gets away with this sort of stuff. There's also been, the United States has possibly too become a little bit more adroit in its use of diplomacy. So we've seen the Obama administration reaching certain agreements with Cuba, as you know, after all these decades of ostracising Cuba. And this may in part be an attempt to draw Cuba away from Venezuela and other left governments in Latin America. We do see Latin American unity decreasing at the present time. The Organisation of American States, which is a creature of the United States, has been quite active recently in taking steps against Maduro, or attempting to take steps against Maduro, and criticising him for not being democratic enough. And as Fernando mentioned, Mercosur, the common market of the South, is also experiencing difficulties at the present time with both Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay objecting to the lack of democracy, as they say, in Venezuela. So a little spat they're having at the present time is that Venezuela is supposed to take over the chairing of Mercosur for the next 2 years, and these countries are objecting. Fortunately, Uruguay is standing up for Venezuela at the present time. Just. It's true too that a lot of Latin American people believe that there are real problems to do with crime, with corruption, and with security issues in general. And so you have right-wingers who can use this against left-wing governments, and they've done that with considerable success. And Macri is an example of this. He really pushes this line that he's going to solve these problems, ignoring the fact, of course, that the right is just as corrupt, if not more corrupt, than the left. Now, how secure are these reforms that we've seen with the pink tide? This is really difficult to know. I'm glad Fernando is optimistic, and he gave me a little lecture today about optimism. He quoted me. Apparently I said that it was our duty to be optimistic. And I think that is right. And some of these reforms, I think, have been institutionalised to an extent. So some of those welfare reforms are going to be pretty difficult to undo by the right, but they will have a go at it. Just as in Australia, we might at certain periods mistakenly think that some of the things that we've won over the years are secure, but then we get these governments in and they start to dismantle them and attack them. Well, the same sort of thing will be happening in Latin America. We'll just have to wait and see on that. Hopefully a lot of these things can't be dismantled. And hopefully the Latin Americans won't be going back to the 1980s and the 1990s, but with some of these people, they will be pushing this, like Macri. They'll be going for austerity. But the right has no answer to the structural problems in Latin America. And part of that has to do with the fact that most of these economies are geared towards the production and export of commodities. So, they have, since the Second World War, they have built up, some of them built up manufacturing sectors in Argentina and Brazil, for example. If they can maintain those, then they're in a much stronger position than if they get reduced to simply being commodity producers. Another bright spot might be, and I was asked whether I was going to mention Donald Trump. And I'll just finish on Donald Trump. Well, what's happening in the US at the moment, and the fact that the policies of the United States governments, the fact that the United States governments haven't been looking after their own people, and the people now are starting to wake up to this and are starting to attack, and unfortunately perhaps not in the way that most of us would like them to be doing, and moving things to the left, that many of them might in fact be moving to the right, and Jim is telling me that we might be moving towards fascism in the United States. And certainly if you look at Trump, then he ticks a lot of those boxes. But the fact that the United States is undergoing problems might be good for Latin America, and might once again mean that Latin America can't focus on Latin America as it has traditionally done. Thank you.